a great pleasure. Both Ed and myself have been hosted by you a few times in the many events you organize. You've been very active. Obviously, you were living in Ukraine until not long ago, but as we know, everyone knows, unfortunately, the situation has changed. And I think it's great to get your perspective of what's happening, how resilient has been the banking system there, and what do you see in terms of trends that this war is bringing to Europe. Vlad, a great pleasure to have you with us.
Hello, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Altman, Gabriel Sabata, and their teams for this invitation. In fact, back in 1996, I started my career in risk management just with applying Professor Altman famous models, especially models for the emerging markets. So today it's a really special day in my life to speak together with Professor Edward Altman, with Gabriel Sabata, and their colleagues today. Yes, I am from Ukraine, and unfortunately, I think Ukraine now is a country that experiences the highest level of distress. And I was asked by Edward and Gabriel to give this brief overview of what's going on with the banking system in this country. And correct me if I'm wrong, but many people in the world expected if the war of this scale started, Ukrainian banking system would work for a couple of days and then, how it's to say, go for holiday. And luckily, the reality became a little bit different. Sorry. The banking system of Ukraine is operational, and it's a big surprise, I think, for many people in the world. And in this presentation, I try to explain what are behind this operational and active position of the banks in this country. Next slide, please. And to do that, I need to probably give a little bit a look in the history, what preceded the war. And I would like to draw your attention to two major developments. First, in 2014, 2018, we had a really serious radical banking reform. So there were introduction of ultimate ownership disclosure of the banks. It was a reform on corporate governance with a special role of the supervisory boards. It was a strong move towards the implementation of Basel II and Basel III as a part of association agreement between the European Union and Ukraine, and where all key risks were addressed, including liquidity risk with LCR, with NSFR ratios. It was introduction of the IFRS accounting standards and IFRS 9 in particular. And the recent developments, it's an update in the BCP. It's a business continuity planning of the banks and the central bank. And the heavy stress tests were undertaken by our regulator. It's one component. The second component is digitalization. The digitalization of the economy in the world, including the banking system. And it also happened in Ukraine, especially COVID was a sort of facilitator of this process. And mobile banking became widespread in Ukraine. Remote identification and verification of the customers is also became available with Bank ID as a special project run by the central bank. And even the government service that used to be quite bureaucratic now also moved to this digital time. And we have a special smartphone application where you can, in remote mode, you can use some state services and receive some supports, financial supports, and also open the accounts in the banks. Next slide, please. And as a result of these two developments, we have that about half of the banking system was liquidated, no, in terms of the number of banks. So all these banks, maybe it's also we could call them zombie banks. They went bankrupt. They were liquidated by the central bank. The largest bank in Ukraine, Privat Bank, maybe you had this name, it was privatized. Now it accounts for the 90% of the total banking system. It was put a strong control over the money laundering, on the lending to the connected parties. It was a big problem in our old, so-called old banking system. And finally, risk management and proper risk management and corporate governance started its implementation according to the roadmap. On the left, you see the chart from the central bank as risk indicators for the whole system, banking system, was developing during these 6-7 years, moving from red to blue to normal. And it was just really, we came to the rather healthy banking system. And now we have 69 banks before the war with a historical record profit. And total assets not too high, but still it's 65 billion US dollars. With high liquidity and with the development of the economy and banking system. Next slide, please. But the war that Ukraine faces now is not the first war. Back in 2014, I think you remember the time that Russia already invaded our country. It was resulted in the annexion of the Crimea and occupation of the parts of the eastern region of Ukraine. And during that very hostile time, some banks had to relocate their operations, their IT infrastructure, their personnel from the eastern part of Ukraine to the central and west. And here on the right, you see the interesting case. It's one of the largest private bank in Ukraine, First Ukrainian International Bank, that had a headquarters in Donetsk, in the eastern part of Ukraine. He had to do this very quickly to move all the facilities, personnel, made the IT relocation to the central and to the eastern part. And all this was just supported with the development of the new versions of the BCP, this business continuity plans of the bank. And when the active phase of this war reached at the end in 2015 with the Minsk agreement, so even since then, the Ukraine, our country, maintained the military front with constant shelling from Russian proxy and deaths among the soldiers. So for us, it was a time from 2015 till now, it was a time of the really very, very serious preparation. And now, please, next slide. When the war started, these BCPs of the central bank and our commercial banks, they were just put on the table, and they started the implementing of these BCPs, these plans of continuity of business. So first of all, the central bank introduced some controls on the FX and the market and regarding the capital outflow. So there is some restrictions on cross-border transactions, but still there is a possibility to import some critical goods, critical services that needed for the country to defend itself. It was a reduction of the requirements on the capital regulation. So the implementation of Basel III and Basel III was postponed. No regulatory action against banks that fails with some prudential normatives was also introduced by the central bank. The central bank, and together with commercial banks, so they had a backup of their ITs to the reserve sites. The head offices of the banks were relocated even from Kiev to the western part of Ukraine. Some senior executives moved to Poland, to other countries, and just managing the banks outside. It was allowed for the bank to keep the databases and their IT infrastructure in the cloud. That was also very good decision, very timely decision. And for example, to let the private individuals their access to their finance, so it was allowed for retail chains, to shops, to supermarkets, to allow the customers for cash withdrawals from their banking cards. To prevent panic, also it was introduced a daily limit of cash withdrawal. It's about $3,000. It's inside the country. 3,000 country. It's possible to withdraw from your cards if a person just is abroad, outside the country, but per month. And also, it's also very, very strong and very convincing move. It was the introduction of the guarantee on the 100% of the deposits of the private individuals, compared to just up to $7,000 it was before the war. To support the lending, so the central bank recommended banks to use the credit holidays, so allowing the customers not to pay interest on their loans. The government introduced the guarantee on the loans on the critical industries with risk sharing mechanism. I will touch upon this a little bit later. And for some segments, like SME segments, it was a specific program, credit program, with a 0% interest introduced. So at this moment, we have the SEP, it's the name of our interbank payment system. It's operational, 26 hours per day, 7 days a week, and the transfer from one bank to another takes up to 20 minutes. And for example, for me as a private individual, also, if I want to transfer some money from one bank in Ukraine to the other, it will take, I would say, a couple of hours, the same day, for sure. Plastic banking cards also working fine, both in Ukraine and outside Ukraine. And on the next slides, I will give you some more details of the dynamic on what's going on. Please, next slide. In addition to these two major developments, like a bank sector reform and digitalization, I must also draw your attention to the third, and I think to the third one. And this one is very crucial. As one chief risk officer of our banks put it, the most valuable asset for the banks during these 3 months of the war was the personnel of the bank that was committed to keep the banking system up and running. It's not only just the people on the bank. It's, I must just tell that I see it's across all segments of the population. So most of the Ukrainians are very committed to defend the country in every possible way, if not in the armed forces, but just trying to keep their businesses up and running, or paying the taxes, not waiting for the deadlines, but paying just after the end of the reporting periods. It's also commonplace. And so Here, compared to Russia, in Ukraine, we have a lot of horizontal connections, horizontal influences. So we don't need to get the order from the top to do something. For example, our company, it's a very small consulting company, and we assisting banks for more than 20 years, for banks in Ukraine and the banks in the region. And on the 11th of March, it was 2 weeks after the start of this full-scale war, we arranged this conference for the banks, understanding they need to coordinate their efforts, they need to exchange their experience. And it was fully our initiative, and it was, we had about more than 130 participants from the senior management and middle management of the banks. So let's move on, and I will try to give you some more details on the developments. Next slide, please. Here you see how the branches in Ukraine are open right now. So on the 6th of May, we see that 79% of all branches are open. It's 3,000, more than about 4,000 outlets across the Ukraine. And you see this different colors of the zone, how it goes. Next slide. Deposits on retail side on the left and corporate deposits on the right. You can see that the green line is growth of the retail deposits. It's let's say current accounts, not term deposits, but still in local currency. But you see the growth, and we have reduction in the deposits and current accounts in foreign currencies. Corporate deposits also, it's a flight to the quality with the moving of the funds from local banks to state banks and to the banks with foreign capitals. Just for your information, in Ukraine, the state banks accounts for about 1/2 of the banking system, and the international banks, it's another 30%. Next slide. In terms of the loans, we see the big drop in the loans to the private individuals, but the corporate loans, it's on the rise. And roughly for these 3 months, the banks lended about $1 billion US dollars, and with the strong support of the governments. The 2/3 of that, it was lent for the agribusiness, because it's a sow campaign and this money was needed. Next slide. And unfortunately, of course, the first quarter, it's statistics from the central bank. It was a reduction, fell in the profitability. So the bank got a little bit of loss because of the huge loss in March. But still, the recognition of the NPLs, it's still just on the agenda. We will be expected. Next slide, please. And the next block is how the war impacted the Ukraine, and what was the bank response. Next slide, please. Here you see the situation in March versus April. And if in March 10 regions of Ukraine were under occupation, that accounts for 55% of GDP of the country in the past. In April, end of April, it's only 6 with 20% of GDP. And according to the statement of the central bank, they expect that this year, 2022, the drop in GDP would be up more than 30%, unfortunately. Next slide, please. Here, the agri sector. Ukraine is one of the largest agri producer and exporter. And again, the situation is not far from to be bright. 20-25% of sown winter crops are under occupation. Another 10% just only recently released. The key problem is the blocked marine ports, so it prevents us from the exporting the grains and other commodities. The agri companies facing the input deficits and increase in production and logistic costs. Physical losses of the assets and minefields, it's also the big problem. Ukraine faces the huge labor deficit. More than 6 million of the population left the country due to these hostilities. Next slide, please. Here, it's very interesting statistics from Privatbank. Privatbank, I just remind you, it's 20% of the banking system in Ukraine. And here you see the decrease, huge decrease in terms of the payments in volumes and quantity from March 22 compared to the last year. And see in April, the growth not very strong, but still we can see this growth. And compared to the 32% of the companies that stopped their operations in March, at the end of April, it was only 17. Next slide, please. Here it's for you who want to dig a little bit deeper. It's just statistics on the payments from Privatbank by industries. It's also interesting. I will not just spend too much time. You can receive these slides after the webinar and you can research them. Next slide, please. And how the banks reacted to the behavior of the borrowers. In February, end of February, up to 100% of all borrowers received this credit holidays. So did not pay anything. But in May, the situation became different. Only 30 of these borrowers still did not pay. The worst time was between March and April with 35, like NPLs. How bank reacted? So they started to just keep talking to the clients. All corporate clients were contacted. SMEs and private individuals were also contacted, just selected of them. So banks running these client surveys wanted to know what is the business plans, what is the situation with assets, what is the situation with relocation. So they just in constant link connection with their clients. They combine portfolio and individual approach. They focus less on the financials. Of course, it would be not relevant, but mostly on the repayments. And this risk sharing initiative of the government, it was very supportive, and the banks, most of the loans, especially to the critical industry that you just see also in the slides, are supported by the government, like 50%. Government takes just responsibility of the loans. Next slide, please. And of course, the war in Ukraine cannot be just easy for the global economy. It became another, facilitator, another factor that adds the uncertainty to the global economy. Next slide, please. Here, it's also statistics on the share of Ukraine and Russia in the crop export. And you see, for example, for the sunflower seed oil, so it's about 78, about 80% of the export. So, and for many countries, especially in the developing worlds, I know that they heavily dependent on this supply from Ukraine and from Russia. And now, because of these problems with exports, they would suffer. The same could be with some other commodities. And my next slide, please. It's already presented in the Financial Times the impact of these shortages on the prices on the commodities in the world. In addition to the agri commodities of Ukraine, also oil and gas became the big problem. So at the end, please next slide. It's a final slide. I thank you for your attention. I'm ready to take your questions, and really, we highly appreciate all you and your countries who supporting Ukraine in this fights for democracy and the rule of law in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vlad. Thanks, a very interesting presentation, this one. And the way you started is exactly what I thought. Like when a war starts, I would think that the whole banking system would shut down, or as you say, go on holiday. So it's quite impressive to see the response there. So very, very interesting. So thank you so much.